Okay, let's start. Let me start by thanking Patricia Alba for doing all of the technical work and the advertisement for this event. I also want to thank all of you for joining in, and especially our speakers who have taken their time during the summer to participate in this. For the Center of Latin American Studies, and I am the director of the center, Carlos de la Torre, for our center it's very important to be an intellectual community in a space of academic discussion about pressing issues of the moment. And one of the most important issues that is happening right now is again the discussion over racism, police brutality, the disregard of lives of people of brown and especially black color. So we have to discuss all of these issues. And we started with an event a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, on police brutality in the Americas. And this is the second event that we are having. I think that the best way to understand how racism works as an institutionalized system of power and domination is to do comparative and interdisciplinary work. So today we have three experts, an expert on education, an anthropology, and an historian that will compare experiences in several Latin American countries, like in several countries in the Americas, sorry, like Cuba, Mexico, Ecuador, and the United States. So let me start first by introducing all of the speakers, and then each of them will have for about 20 minutes to give their presentations, and then we will have a time for question and answers, and also for an engagement between the panelists. So our first panelist is Dr. Chris Busey. Dr. Busey is an assistant professor in the Teachers School and Society program in the School of Teaching and Learning at the University of Florida. He teaches courses for the critical studies in race, ethnicity, and cultural specialization. Dr. Busey is recently a research project examines Afro-Latinx and Afro-Latin American history and citizenship education, intersections of African American and Afro-Latin American racial thought, and the racial politics of education for Afro-descendants across the Americas. The title of his presentation today is No Humans Involved, Anti-Blackness and Education Across the Americas. Then Dr. Carmen Martinez Novo, who's a professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Center for Latin American Studies, will present her talk. She's an anthropologist and the author of Undoing Multiculturalism, Resource Extraction and Indigenous Rights in Ecuador, that is in press, and her other book, which is Who Defines Indigenous, Identities, Intellectuals, and the State in Northern Mexico. She's also the author of an edited volume, Edited Issues, a number of articles and book chapters on indigenous identities in politics in Mexico and Ecuador. The third speaker, the third panelist, is Dr. Lilian Guerra. She's the author of many scholar articles, works of public scholarship, and essays, as well as 4 published books of history. Her first book was on Puerto Rico, Popular Expressions of National Identity in Puerto Rico. The second book was The Myth of José Martí, Conflicting Nationalism in Early 20th Century Cuba, and then Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959-1971. Visions of Power in Cuba received the Bryce Good Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association. The talk of Dr. Lilian's presentation is Anti-Racism in Cuba is Not Racial Equality, 1895-2020. And I think I forgot to mention the title of Carmen Martinez Novo's talk, which is Paternalism, Ventriloquism, and Other Forms of Ritual Humiliation in the Americas. So let's start with Dr. Busey and his talk, No Humans Involved, Anti-Blackness and Education Across the Americas.
All right, good morning, everyone. Carlos, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for hosting another panel out of the Center for Latin American Studies that is relevant to our current social political context that we are seeing not just in the US, but across the Americas. I also want to thank everyone for attending, my fellow panelists, as well as participants who are here through YouTube. I think we all know the importance of this conversation. Today, I'm not going to present any specific study or get into the specificity of any particular case, so to say. What I want to do is to discuss more broadly the notion of anti-Blackness and relate this to some of the theoretical work that has been done and that continues to be done with regards to anti-Blackness and the invention of the Black subject as non-human. And so what I'm going to do is to discuss the complicity of curriculum, of educational curriculum, both in terms of public school as well as in the academy, and discuss the complicity of curriculum in the invention of the Black subject as non-human, as well as anti-citizen. I'm going to provide a conceptual frame using Sylvia Wynter's NHI. And to do so, to ground this work, I'm going to toggle between two different entry points into the conversation. So what I'll be doing is drawing from two distinct papers, one that I'm co-authoring with a doctoral student at the University of Florida, Tiana Dawi Chen. And again, I'm focusing on curriculum because the curriculum, as Wynter notes, it structures consciousness and therefore also structures the attitudes and behaviors of individuals. And so hence my focus on how these discourses manifest in curriculum. Before I get into the depth of my brief talk this morning, I did want to first lay out my approach to the conversation today. I find this even more important because I love the relational act of teaching, of developing relationships built on intellectual curiosity with students. But I find these panels to be sometimes impersonal, sometimes fleeting, and oftentimes performative in nature. And so in a break from other panels I've been on and that I'm seeing, I want to discuss some of my current thoughts on this topic as a precedent for sharing my research as I toggle between these two papers. So as we know, there appears to be, or at least on surface, there appears to be a newfound interest in race studies across the hemisphere. And as I've discussed with a doctoral student a few days ago, the amount of panels and discourse has been gratifying on one end as a scholar of race and education who has been preaching this for years. But I'm also deeply concerned, right? And what I find to be disconcerting is the already shift or pivot away from anti-Blackness as the focal point of these conversations. And so before I get into this work and before any of my fellow panelists get into this work, I want us to think about the current context. Statues, building names, chants that are visible vestiges of enslavement and accumulation are being taken down, but the afterlife of slavery that represent the present day materialities of the anti-Black conditions that these people upheld are still unaddressed. All right, so we're already shifting away from anti-Blackness. Instead of talking about the similarities in death technologies used across the Americas, the knees and the boots on necks, how Joanne Florville in Santiago, Chile, and Sandra Bland in Houston died under police custody, or looking at how police and paramilitary forces engage in the same death squad tactics from Louisville, Kentucky to Cauca, Colombia, or the favelas in Rio, right? We're shifting and pivoting away from anti-Blackness. So universities and various institutions are rather passively referencing Black life, but only in Spectre. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about Spectre in a moment as a focal point of my talk. But there's the rush to all of a sudden educate, to read about Black people, but not read with Black people. And I'm gonna say that again, there's the rush to all of a sudden educate, to read about Black people, but not read with Black people, right? And so thus white folk are still leading parallel Black absent lives across the Americas. And I would argue that this sudden interest merely replicates the extractive and consumeristic nature by which many approach knowledge and Blackness itself. So there's an industry around this current moment that, like many things, is driven by Black flesh as well as Black thought without Black people. And so what I want to do with my talk today is I want to deal with the specificity of anti-Blackness for a moment here. And that's that people sit with anti-Blackness. And precisely, I'm going to turn to Sylvia Wynter, who noted this very same pivot in her quoting of sociologist Christopher Jinks. And she quotes Jinks, who said, "We're always trying to reduce race to something else. Yet out there on the streets, race does not reduce to something else." And when Sylvia Wynter quotes Jinks, she implicates academia as holding the key to race, and therefore the classification logic of the acronym NHI, which is again the focal point of my talk today. So I'm going to speak to academia, but also education more broadly. So the acronym NHI stands for No Humans Involved. In Wynter's germinal essay, written on the backdrop of the 1992 Los Angeles protests, following the acquittal of 4 white police officers in the brutal beating of Rodney King, Wynter notes how police and judicial officials routinely referred to any case involving the breach of the rights of Black males as NHI, no humans involved. And this was not simply a discursive reference, but it also served the purpose of allowing police to deal with Black people in any way they pleased. And so while I'm not going to delve into the entirety of Wynter's germinal essay, I do want to build from the questions that Wynter posed to make an entree into understanding the role of curriculum and reproducing ideas about Black people as non-human and anti-citizen. So Wynter asked, how does the term NHI come to be held by the judicial officers who are, quote unquote, the best and brightest graduates of our university systems in the United States, by those whom we ourselves as professors, academics have educated? And so again, hence we're implicating academia here. And I think what we have to do in these conversations is take a hard look at what academia and even those departments that create curriculum that deal with race and area studies continue to replicate when the curriculum is void of Black subjectivities, and also when the hallways are void of Black faculty and Black students, and we treat this as normative status quo operating procedure. But again, to extend this more broadly, Wynter also asked, where did this system of classification come from? And how did they come to conceive of what it means to be both human and North American as white, middle class, college educated, and therefore perceive of and behave towards Black people as the lack of human, as the conceptual other? So I've argued and I've studied, and other studies will show across the Americas, that the belief of Black people and Black subjectivities as non-human is embedded by school curriculum. So there are countless scholars across the Americas, such as Nilma Gomez, Karina Santos, Guimarães in Brazil. We could look at Elizabeth Castillo, Jose Antonio Caicedo, Nancy Palacios in Colombia. You could look at the research of Anio Coro Loango in Argentina. And here in the US, you could look at the research of Ashley Woodson, Cynthia Diller, Bettina Love, who are telling us as such that the Black subject enters into the curricular consciousness as both specter and spectacle, and thus non-human. And so we have been conditioned and socialized through curriculum across the Americas to view Black life and Black subjectivities as spectacles and specters. And it's important to note that the very definition of a spectacle is paradoxical in nature, right? Which I think captures the essence of Black life in relation to the nation state. It's a paradox. A spectacle is defined as something exhibited to view as unusual, notable, or entertaining. It is an object of contempt or curiosity. And I want us to hone in on the word object. A specter, on the other hand, is a visible, disembodied spirit, something that haunts, or perturbs the mind. So given these two definitions, right, just take a moment to yourself to think about how we've been conditioned to view Black life as spectacle and specter. So consider that the Black body itself, Black flesh, the Black subject, typically enters school curriculum as both spectacle and specter, usually as an enslaved person, unnamed, and untenable to the things that we associate with life. The ability to love, the ability to speak, the ability to be mobile, and thus the ability to be human. All right, so I always encourage my students to think about this very thing. We know Martha Washington, we know Eleanor Roosevelt, we know Abigail Adams, right? White folk are assigned the ability to love. How often do we position Black intimacy in the curriculum? These things that associate us with life. The ability to speak. All right, so when we think about school curriculum, when is the first time that a Black person is given voice in the curriculum? Think about Black mobility and their surveillance of Black life, right? The opportunity to move, to come and go as we please. How do we prioritize Black mobility in curriculum? So we're merely a disembodied body that we know to be a specter, a ghost, whose very personhood is refined to machinery-like labor, and whose end result of death is predetermined, necropolitical, with no story. All right, and so the totality and breadth of global Black life is ignored. Our story begins, as if to quote Dr. Cynthia Dillard, as if Black people just happened to be in the Americas, as if we just happened to be enslaved, as Black folk just happened to have suffered 4 centuries of degradation and inequities. And thus, before any effort is made in any child's schooling, all right, and I'm using schooling intentionally here, not education, but any child's schooling experience to center Black life, they are first taught that the status of the Black subject is one of NHI, no humans involved. And this is why it's important to put Schomburg's writings in relation to Sylvia Wynter. So we have Schomburg, an Afro-Puerto Rican thinker, who is often just positioned as a bibliophile, right? But this is someone who is involved in Black thought and transnational Black thought. He was attempting to script humanists onto Black historical subjectivities when he wrote The Negro Digs Up His Past and when he wrote Racial Integrity. And so I want to return to the idea that we've been conditioned and socialized as consumers to view Black life and Black subjectivities within the quest for modernity, which situates Black life itself as debatable and expendable. We have to talk about contracts or racial contracts, such as constitutions, which are seen as white agreements. And even in the midst of multicultural constitutional and political reforms, such as the ones we see throughout Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s, Black subjectivities are still underwritten into the contract. All right, so as a recent research study that I'm working on demonstrates, we can understand laws such as Ley 70, the law of Black communities in Colombia, as an agreement extended by the nation state, not intended to transform the nation state, one that continues to position the Afro-Colombian as spectacle and specter and ensures that although extended the liberal gift of citizenship, Blackness is still underwritten. It's assigned a different anagrammatical meaning within the state. And so the specter, that although phantom, provides us with a positioning of the Black body as simply raw material, a state of non-being, as Fanon notes, and as living in the wake, right? To quote Christina Sharp, whereby we live within the subjugation of Black life to death. And when not subjected to these curricular narratives of specter and spectacle, Black subjectivities adopt the narrative of anti-citizen, right? And this is that second foray into NHI, where the denial of sovereign citizenship becomes key here, because Black folk across the Americas are emancipated, but our status as full citizens respective to the nation state remains indeterminate. And so this too remains an absent discourse in curricula in our public schools and universities. And so people are living under the falsehood that Black lives mattered when the Voting Rights Act was passed, when constitutions were rewritten in Nicaragua, Brazil, and Colombia to include the recognition of Black territory, but still Again, we have an anagrammatical inclusion of citizenship. But what our current context demonstrates is that Black people exist within the nation state as neither fully human nor fully citizen. This is what Jaime Alves terms as the double negation of Black life. So both Sylvia Wynter as well as Mbebe make it clear that the Western invention of the Black subject was always equated with being both non-human and anti-citizen, right? And we have to trace this to the physical reference of man, quote unquote, as a political subject, in the creation and the invention of the Black person of African descent as racially inferior or the human other, right? So this anti-citizenship and non-human conundrum is especially clear in our current civic displays. So Hartman in the interview reminds us that both Blackness and Black people are called upon to affirm the state, but only until our present Sully's paradise, as Sean Gay will state. So whereby any collective or any individual effort by Black people, especially Black women, to contest white supremacy and racial capital, right, across the Americas is usually met with prison, exile, or death. So we have, again, this non-human anti-citizen conundrum. I want to conclude by discussing what our current and collective movements are providing educators and educational researchers with the grounds for not only questioning how we teach Black life, but also Black life relative to the denial of full sovereign citizenship. So that is, despite any formal political or constitutional recognition of citizenship, NHI, no humans involved, will never allow a realization of Black people as fully human citizens, right? To return to Wynter, it gives officials the green light to do as they please. And so the Black boy can easily become Hulk Hogan, or the Black boy can easily become armed with concrete. To quote Sharp, the Black girl can easily become sassy or hypersexualized, and the Black mother becomes a birther of terror. And this justifies the state's non-human and anti-citizenship treatment of Black folk. All right, so there's the denial of citizenship when we see the murder of Marielle Franco in the public streets of Rio. That's considered the norm. The dispossession of Black land, the displacement of Black people in Colombia, the forced, right, sexual labor of Afro-Colombian women who've been forced into migration is considered the norm. In fact, these visible manifestations of anti-Blackness provide social meaning to the institutions and their processes. All right, we will not know democracy, or rather the illusion of democracy, without anti-Blackness. And so I want to come full circle. All right, so in education, I'm going to say that we must seek to untangle these unjust processes that are tied to the global prison industrial complex, Black land dispossession, the extrajudicial killings of Black citizens, right? But we must also capture the translocal and transnational movements that have spurred from these moments. But more importantly, in education, I'm going to argue that we do not have to humanize what is already human. But what we do have to do, however, is move towards the humanization of citizenship and of Black life in the curriculum. And so this is my entree into the conversation for today. I know it's kind of theoretical in nature, but I welcome your comments and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Busey. Dr. Martinez Novo, please.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can share my, okay, there. Okay, do you see my screen now? Let's see if I can move.
Yes.
but I cannot move it. Oh, sorry about this. How do I change this? Oh, I see it here. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start. So the title of my talk is Paternalism, Ventriloquism, and Other Forms of Ritual Humiliation in the Americas. And I think it has a lot of connections with what Chris just discussed. So I'm very excited about the conversation. Let me go to slide 2. So in this talk, I want to focus on paternalism, ventriloquism, and I will explain what that is to me, and other forms of subtle discrimination, ideas and practices that are not often recognized as racism, but that are very effective to produce, maintain, and justify inequalities, police racial boundaries, and reproduce systemic racism. I will base my discussion on my research and fieldwork in Mexico and Ecuador. In my book, Who Defines Indigenous, I discuss what it means to be an indigenous farm worker and an indigenous urban street vendor at the Mexican side of the US border. Actually, it's exactly the same population that works as farm workers in Florida. So that's like interesting. The population that I studied were Mixtecs coming from the states of Guerrero and Oaxaca, who were migrating to the north of Mexico, to the Baja California, particularly to the city of Tijuana, and that's the street vendors, and to the valley of San Quintin that produces fruits and vegetables for export to the United States. Although my research was initially about indigenous migrant identities, I ended up, because I was looking at how indigeneity was defined both from above and from below by the farm workers themselves, I ended up studying racism. And I soon realized that many discriminatory concepts and practices that I witnessed were not posed as hostility or violence, but as love and concern for the indigenous migrants. In my later work in Ecuador, I have found paternalism and other forms of subtle discrimination, such as ventriloquism, which is when non-Indians or non-indigenous people feel entitled to talk for indigenous people, to be central to the perpetuation of racial hierarchies. In the north of Mexico, dominant groups did not easily accept that there was racism in their own society. More often, they associated the phenomenon to the treatment of immigrants in the United States. This is very common in Latin America. They would say racism is more a US thing, or they associated racism to the south of Mexico that was more hierarchical than the north. They think of the north as whiter and more democratic than the south. So they associated racism to these other places. As theories of race have noted, like Thun van Dijk, racism is often displaced in time to the past. It happened in the past, but it's not real anymore, or somewhere else, to another region or to another country. I conceptualize and racism as a changing and fluid and highly contextual. So one of my interests has been to look at racism and paternalism and look at the specific instances, how it is expressed in the specific cultural context. But also how racism is a result of wider legacies of colonialism and wider kind of patterns, and at the same time very local. So I'm looking at the local and global manifestations of racism. I think in my experience in 2 Latin American countries, I have noticed that open racism and paternalism are not mutually exclusive, but they work together and complement each other. Depending on the circumstances and the power relations at the moment, one style can take precedence over the other, but both tend to coexist. Paternalism seeks consent for the maintenance of social hierarchies and does not use physical but symbolic violence. And that's why symbols, specific cultural items are very important here. If the target population does not state on what the dominant group defines as their proper place, the powerful may resort to open hostility or more violent means of asserting power. As it is well known, racist violence is also not random, but also culturally specific. But so it's not like a specific characteristic of paternalism. to be expressed in symbolic and cultural ways that are both historical and depending on the local political economies, economic interests, and so on. I have paid attention also to the intersections of paternalism with class and gender. I will explain how very often the people who perform paternalistic relations, the dominant groups, confuse race and ethnicity and culture with poverty and low socioeconomic status. Basically, they take manifestations of poverty for the culture and worldview of the group, in this case, the indigenous group. Also, indigenous women are also represented as deviant from proper gender norms, particularly as bad mothers. The street vendors are seen as bad mothers who exploit their own children or even rent children to sell in the streets. On the other hand, the other way this is gender is that paternalists, the people performing paternalism, and I sometimes call it maternalism, are often women because paternalism is seen as care work for the poor, the vulnerable, or the minoritized populations, and is often performed by women in the form of charity, social work, and so on. In my work in Mexico and Ecuador, I have found the phenomenon of paternalism to be central to interethnic relations, but also understudied. And my argument is that it has been understudied because we tend to focus, as Chris was saying, maybe as a form of a specter or a spectacle, on the minoritized populations, but not so much on those who hold power and influence in society. So since we don't focus on them, I think that phenomenon has remained invisible. And I think an emergent work that is being done today on whiteness and privilege in Latin America, for example, Hugo Cerón Anaya, Ana Ramos Sayas, and others, my own work too, are starting to work more on whiteness and privilege in Latin America, and probably will fill this gap. So I move on to the definitions of paternalism. One person who studied paternalism in the 1960s, and this is within the debate about the contrast of race relations in the United States and Latin America, was Peter van den Berg. He compared racism in Mexico, Brazil, and the United States. And he divided systems of race relations into paternalistic and competitive. He thought that it was he was a modernization theory, so he thought that there was kind of an evolution from paternalistic race relations that were typical of agrarian societies to competitive race relations that were more democratic but required physical segregation of groups and were also more violent, to racial democracy. That's what he thought was happening. But I think his definition of paternalism, I will argue that paternalism is pervasive today in Latin America and also in the United States. His definition, I think, is useful. And what he says is the dominant group rationalizes its rule in an ideology of benevolent despotism and regards members of the subordinate group as childish, immature, irresponsible, in short, as inferior, but lovable as long as they stay in their place. Roles and statuses are sharply defined along racial lines, with a rigidly ascriptive division of labor and great asymmetry in social relations. Social distance between racial castes is maximized and symbolized by an elaborate and punctilious etiquette. Prejudice often takes the form of pseudo-tolerance, as exemplified by professions of love for the subordinate group as long as inequality is unchallenged. So I think his definition, even though I don't take his evolutionary view, is still very useful to think about this. Other definitions, Mary Jackman has a very useful book entitled The Velvet Glove. It's about paternalism in the United States, and she defines paternalism as the phenomenon of discrimination without the expression of hostility. So one of the problems with racism in the United States is that people can only complain of racism with this hostile and openly violent manifestation. But this paternalism is something that is not regulated, or some people could call it microaggressions, but it's very difficult to address, and because it doesn't pass perhaps it's what is being more addressed these days as unconscious bias or something like that, but not exactly. So what interests me about it is that it's very difficult to catch and also to respond to it. So it's very important to conceptualize it. Paternalism has been studied by philosophers. Donald van der Beer, in a book entitled A Paternalistic Intervention, The Moral Bounds of Benevolence, also defines paternalism as interference with the autonomy of another for their own good. And he argues that it is only justified in case of temporary or permanent incompetence, but he looks at history and he says that it has been used very often for women, minoritized populations, and the poor. So, and he argues that it's very problematic in these cases because basically it can be posed as benevolence, but it assumes and imposes the idea of the inferiority of the other person. So from there, I'm going to move to some examples from my fieldwork in Mexico. And my first example is about the farm workers in Mexico. The farm workers, when I did my fieldwork, was in the end of the 90s, they suffered terrible working conditions in Baja California. They worked for long hours for very low pay, $4 a day at the time. They live in temporary camps, were sprayed with pesticides and had a lot of health problems because of that. They also very often were cheated of their wages or not paid on time. And on top of that, there was the stereotype, as it happens also in Florida, that they were a mobile transient population, and that was used by the government institutions not to provide services for them. They said, well, they are moving from one place to the other, so they don't need education, healthcare, and so on. They were very organized politically, as often happens in Mexico. People are very politically organized. They had very militant unions. They had a long history of activism in Baja California, and they had also been repressed by the government at the time. Some people had been disappeared or killed. And as you can see, like the activism there in the picture. Okay, but I'm gonna talk about, despite this history, how they were represented. I look at a riot of farm workers, and I look at how they were represented in the press, and also how they were represented by government officials and others that I interviewed, and how the farm workers represented themselves. Although they were very well organized, they were often represented as passive victims who were manipulated by outside agitators. They were seen as people without an agency of their own, who only acted politically when manipulated by others or under the effects of hunger or alcohol. Either they were drunk, they were hungry, or they were manipulated, but they were not kind of politically active subjects, which connects very well with what Chris was explaining before. This image of farm workers as passive victims was very useful to state officials and politicians who would appoint themselves and who appointed themselves and their advocates as advocates, and talk for them while ignoring their demands and activism. This is what I call ventriloquism. And that's exactly what Chris was saying before, that even though there is a debate about farm workers, the voice of farm workers is like an specter, is absent from the conversation. And I trace that to colonial legal definitions of Indians as legal minors who could not represent themselves and had to be represented by people called protectores de indios, Indian advocates, who were officials of the crown or sometimes members of the church. Up to the present, in Mexico and also in Ecuador, government officials, politicians, priests, self-appoint themselves as advocates for indigenous peoples and speak for them. Okay, another example that I have, and I don't know how I'm doing with time, is, well, actually I'm gonna skip over this example so I can also talk about my examples of Ecuador. And I'll go to the last example. Another example for my Mexican field, where I work with an elite woman who did development work in a neighborhood where indigenous migrant women and children lived. This woman helped register indigenous migrants with the state. She provided birth certificates for them, gave them access to some health care, and taught them reading and writing with the aim to help them achieve elementary school diplomas that were necessary in Tijuana to work in factories. They needed an elementary school diploma to work there. She strived to transform rural indigenous migrants into an urban working class that could work in the maquilas. However, while she was doing all this, what she understood as a good service for indigenous migrants, particularly women and children, she addressed adult indigenous people as children, tried to control their sexuality. She always complained about the number of children that they had, and she even said that the white people would have to tie their legs so they didn't have any more children. She thought that they could not be taught to reason when teaching them to read and write, but they could only be taught to memorize and do repetitive tasks, just like sign their name, but not really be taught to understand the reading that they were doing. She also believed in ideas of purity and contamination that contributed to the social separation between her team of development workers and the population they serve. Indigenous people reacted to her with a mixture of collaboration to get the benefits that she was providing to them, and resistance to avoid the humiliations. Sometimes they internalize ideas about their own impurity, and they tried to show that they were hygienic, like show how clean they were, but it was never enough for her. This was a manifestation of racism, but she really understood the interaction to be informed by love, a sense of service, and even a national duty for her as a Mexican elite, the national. So I'm going to shift to my work in Ecuador and also talk about ventriloquism and paternalism there. And I'm going to talk about how non-indigenous people in Ecuador feel entitled to talk for indigenous people. And I think this practice that we also saw operating in Mexico originates in the colonial period when indigenous people were segregated from Spaniards, from what was called Spaniards at the time, for the purposes of taxation and labor recruitment. To avoid abuses by those who collected tribute and levied labor for Indians, the Spanish crown appointed advocates who were called, as I said before, protectores de indios. The need for advocates was justified because Indians were defined as minors, as legal minors, and also they were assigned another legal status that is, a student of mine found that it still operates in Ecuador, is the legal status of miserable. It operates as rusticity today with another name. This status was based on 16th century theological discussions and was codified in the laws of the Indies. And even in kind of this status of minors and miserables survived to the 19th century after independence, as did Indian tribute. The miserable status, I want to find the quote there. Yeah, it was defined in this way in the 19th century. It was based on a history of oppression, social conditions of dependency, unintelligible language, biological degradation, and the psychological condition of being adult children. So what we have seen for the farm workers, you can see that is very present in these statuses that were colonial in Latin America, of people being treated as children and also non-rational and so on. One thing that I study as an example of ventriloquism is the concept of buen vivir or summa causae in Ecuador. It's supposed to be an ancient Andean understanding of well-being, and it was used, as you know, very recently by the government of Ecuador, of Rafael Correa from 2007 to 2017. This idea of summa causae is supposed to be an ancient Andean understanding of well-being, and it appears in the constitution that was created in 2008 and also in development plans. And it has also spread from Ecuador and also maybe at the same time to Bolivia in the form of summa camaña, and is taken in other places in Latin America. When you look at the Ecuadorian constitution, what they define as summa causae or buen vivir or good living is basically socioeconomic rights. So that have very little to do, is the ECOSOC second generation human rights that have very little to do with indigeneity. Another way in which they talk about summa causae in the development plan and also by intellectuals is by using these very commonly known stereotypes of indigeneity, harmony with nature, lack of division between nature and culture, and also the idea of sharing and so on, sharing community and so on. I became kind of intrigued about the term because I had not found it before in my fieldwork. And when you look at Andean documents or ethnographies before roughly 2000, you do not find the term. And it's also when you talk to grassroots indigenous people, they don't really know the term. It's not even a correct term in the Quechua language. They argue that alli causai instead of summa causai would be more correct. And it has not been used by indigenous people before. However, some grassroots indigenous peoples have adopted the term more recently because they think it's politically effective. So even they train like the communities and they train their grassroots to understand the term, but it's mostly a term created from above. I interpret this summa causae as another ventriloquist instance of mestizos speaking for indigenous peoples. And when there is like a master thesis by Guillermo Churuchumbi, who is the mayor of an indigenous town in Ecuador, that argues that a lot of the Western critics of that take this idea of summa causae think that summa causae is a critique to Western development and consumerism, and is kind of an ecological term. But when you ask indigenous communities what they think summa causae is, they actually look at it as synonymous with development and synonymous with progress. So they don't see a contradiction. So basically the idea that is a term that challenges development is more like a Western idea, and it might be like a very genuine environmentalist idea, but it's not necessarily coming from the indigenous world. So I see it more as an instance of ventriloquism by mestizos. I have more about this if people are interested in an article that I published in Cultural Studies in 2018. So I'm gonna go to my conclusion. Dominant groups construct indigenous people as childish, non-rational, passive, and in need of mestizo advocacy, mestizo or white advocacy. Indians are perceived as lovable but incompetent. These manifestations of paternalism resonate with colonial definitions of Indians as non-rational as opposed to mestizos who were described as being the razón, as well as with colonial and post-colonial classifications of indigenous peoples as minors. It is important to keep in mind that these stereotypes, although apparently benevolent, assume and uphold beliefs of the inferiority of minoritized groups and aim to manipulate these groups. A characteristic of paternalism is that exclusion is deployed as a form of protection and care work is often performed by women. In Mexico, a government official claimed that indigenous people should be excluded from education and economic advancement in order to protect their culture. Tijuana middle-class merchants claim to protect indigenous children from their mothers or indigenous women from unrewarding work when asking the authorities to remove them from the streets. When indigenous people compete with the middle classes for the attention of tourists. Politicians and scholars in Ecuador claim to include indigenous worldviews in their national projects, but as Chris was saying, they are underwritten, their voice is not there, but they only use indigeneity to legitimize their own white or mestizo plans. The legacy of colonial ventriloquism allows politicians as well as scholars to attribute ideas to indigenous people without checking for either the ethnohistorical, the ethnographic evidence, or even to have a conversation, as Chris was saying, with indigenous people, include those voices there. A perverse consequence is of mestizo advocacy is that indigenous voices are silenced and advocates' constructions are taken for grassroots points of view. Another interesting thing about paternalism and those who practice it in Mexico and Ecuador is that they perceive themselves as progressives, as the protectores de indios did in the past. Conservatives are more likely to use conservatives are more likely to use the openly hostile format of discrimination unless it's not acceptable in the public sphere. And I'm finishing now. I argue that paternalistic social relations are central to understand forms of exclusion in Latin America and elsewhere. Open racism and violence are also a reality, as Chris was also saying, and complement paternalism well. The threat of violence is always there if subordinate groups challenge the role that paternalism is prescribed for them. I do not mean to reproduce the old debate that held that race relations are benevolent or cordial in Latin America, as opposed to the United States, where these relations are more open or violent. On the contrary, I think that this racist cordiality is an effective form of symbolic violence that reproduces race-based hierarchies and systemic racism, particularly when subordinate groups have gathered sufficient strength so that elites cannot exercise open hostility. I suggest that paternalism or this quote-unquote benevolent discrimination is important both in Latin America and the United States. Instead of looking at contrast in race relations, I find it more productive to look at common patterns of racism in the Americas. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I talk too much. I forgot to put my clock.
Thank you, Carmen. Lily?
Let me unshare my, if I can unshare my own stop share. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for her to, okay, there we go. All right, that was great. Yeah, that's a hard act to follow here. So let me start by thanking Dr. De La Torre and the staff at the center for inviting us to participate, and particularly me. There is an incredible degree of timeliness to this invitation and the nature of the topic. And that has to do with the fact that on June 25th, a young Black Cuban named Hansel Hernandez, who is 27 years old, was shot by police as he was fleeing in the back. And his mother posted, or rather his aunt posted a photograph of his dead body on Facebook, which then prompted a response, really an unprecedented response from dozens of activists in Cuba, who really are representative of an unusual spectrum of people, meaning that you don't have just the regular dissidents of human rights activism, but you have a lot of well-known our artists and intellectuals who have been joining in this movement. And they include Tania Bruguera, who won the MacArthur Genius Award several years ago, Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, both of them artists. So effectively yesterday, these activists hoped to stage a protest, and instead, and they had organized a protest over social media, in particular Twitter, under the hashtag of the 30th of June. And instead, they found themselves arbitrarily arrested or detained in their homes by police. So apparently on the orders of Raúl Castro and the relatively new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. 35 activists were detained, 33 more were subject to this police detention in their homes. So the reason this matters is not just its link to the events in the United States, but the fact that Hansel Hernandez's death and the anger and outrage over it really speaks to a generalized consciousness that I think Cubans who grew up in the 1990s through the present, or were born in that period, have come to share, and that is a consciousness of the centrality of racism to Cuba's security state and to its one-party rule. So in fact, the protest that should have taken place yesterday was really doubly treasonous. It was doubly treasonous first because protests of any kind in Cuba are actually legal under Cuban law unless they are sponsored by the government. And that actually also includes protests in favor, perhaps, of a Cuban government policy. You can't actually go out there and support Raúl unless you've been authorized to do so. And then, in fact, you even have to have your slogans approved. So protests are illegal, and that makes this a treasonous act. But more importantly, I would argue, is the fact that any comparison of racial conditions and racism in Cuba with those of the United States is abhorrent to the Cuban Revolution's sense of itself as projected by the state, and really strictly taboo. So there are deep roots to this, and they don't just have to do with the last 60 years of the Cuban Revolution and Communist Party rule. They have to do with the commitment, really, of the Cuban nation from the moment of its birth to the principles of anti-racism. And effectively, those principles were almost immediately, once they were propounded in the 19th century, distorted so as to make anti-racism really a substitute for endorsement and enforcement of racial equality. So in order to really get to that and do so briefly and efficiently, I want to share my screen and show you some slides that will help to elucidate the history of anti-racism in Cuba as a substitute for the endorsement and enforcement of racial equality. And I would argue that this spans much more than the last 60 years or even the last 30, in which the revolution has changed in many respects because the government adopted capitalism under Communist Party rule as a way to survive the absence of the Soviet Union and the withdrawal of what are about $4.4 billion in aid that the Soviets gave the Cuban government beginning in 1972. So this idea that Cubans are not racist and that anti-racism defines Cuban nationality has deep historical roots in Cuba that reach all the way back to the 19th century when Cubans fought 3 wars for independence from Spain. Importantly, really critical to it was that the central figure in all 3 of those wars was a Black man, Antonio Maceo, a general, a man who was not just a general, but an intellectual, who wrote extensively and who is rarely seen as such in any moment, even during his lifetime. What is important about his leadership and that of other Blacks who joined the war front, whether that front was in Cuba or it was abroad, especially in the United States, where there were tens of thousands of emigres, many of whom supported independence from Spain. What makes that really important is that Black leadership in the independence wars of Cuba did not shy away from using the phrase racial equality. In fact, many of them titled their newspapers and their writings Igualdad. So their purpose was very important. And their direction was very important. Without the Black leadership, you would not have had not only the successes that were achieved over the course of these wars, but particularly the last one. You would not have had the foot soldiers who joined the effort. So the wars begin in 1868 when slavery is still in place in Cuba. Abolition and independence went hand in hand. That war ended in a stalemate, supposedly, but really ended with white fears, especially fear among white leaders of the war, that folks like Antonio Maceo were becoming all too legendary and all too powerful. And so 201, that white leadership, virtually 201, signed a truce with the Spanish. And almost 201, the Black leadership refused and gathered to themselves a huge number of foot soldiers. But by the end of these 3 wars, you had a very consistent character to the army. The Liberating Army of Cuba was effectively 75% Black. The Spanish degraded them and denounced them and denigrated them by calling them mambises. And almost immediately, the foot soldiers and other supporters of Cuban independence embraced the term. In the last war, perhaps the most famous proponent of Cuban independence emerged. He had not participated in the earlier wars because he was simply too young. He was exiled to Spain. His name is Jose Martí. And without going any further, you know, he becomes the messiah of Cuban independence. He was called a messiah in his lifetime. He spent 15 years of his life exiled in New York. Because he was a radical and a subversive for the Spanish. Nonetheless, Jose Martí, and importantly, one has to say, was a strategist. And he knew that he had to silence the racists among the whites, whether they were working class, whether they were elite, whose support Cuba needed in order to be free. And so, in fact, it's incredibly important to note that Jose Martí never wrote the words racial equality in any of his writings. And he very much mobilized a kind of paternalistic discourse that depicted Blacks as potential equals once they had proven themselves. But more importantly, he also projected a vision of Cuba that rested on anti-racism, that said that racism was a vestige of the past, that it was akin to an enslavement of the mind perpetrated by colonialists. But he also connected this idea to the image of a meritocracy. So Cuba would be a place that was more than Black or white, said Jose Martí. It was a nation for all, so far as that nation would allow those who worked hard, who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and overcame their past on their own ostensibly, and therefore merited citizenship. So that argument played, in fact, very well with a lot of white racists. And in many respects, that explains what would happen after the war. And after the war, to make a long and very important story short, after the war itself ended not with the victory of Cuba over Spain, but with the US imperial intervention in Cuba in 1898 that was precisely to prevent the Cubans from winning. And so I don't want to go further into that because I could consume a whole, couple weeks of a semester, as I often do. And we don't have that time. But US interventionism had a particularly important effect on race and racial equality. US interventionism ensured that the most conservative side in Cuba would be unconditionally supported by the newest and most important empire in the hemisphere and globally, and that would be the United States. So it turned out that it wasn't even the conservative white pro-independence racists whom the United States backed. The United States, once it took over in 1898, backed Spanish loyalists. That's who they saw as their allies. The very people they had declared war on in 1898, the Spanish and the loyalists, were the allies of US imperialism. And, it was a long and hard fought struggle to get the United States to withdraw in 1902. But when that happened, it happened on a premise that was temporary, that ensured that the United States could come back. And the US very, very deliberately made that happen by blackmailing Cubans and enforcing Cubans to include in the Cuban Constitution of 1901 a stipulation, the Platt Amendment, that allowed for the United States to come back to protect its interests whenever it saw those interests in jeopardy. So in that period of the First Republic, as it's called, which is really 1898 to 1933, there are two very important aspects that one has to mention, two very important tendencies. Clearly, the context of US imperial intervention and its economic dimensions, its political dimensions, are going to disrupt the process of creating a functional sovereign democracy. But secondly, Black veterans of the war found themselves betrayed by the Republican governments, one after the other. They never were compensated with land that they were promised by Jose Martí and other generals, including Máximo Gómez. And then they found themselves displaced from government jobs, first by the United States occupiers, and then later by their former colleagues in the wars, those white politicians who had once been veterans of the Liberating Army. They found they themselves displaced in government jobs by Spanish loyalists. And in this period from 1898 to the 1920s, about 1.2 million Spaniards were brought in as government-funded projects to whiten the country and to stabilize it, right? So we all kind of can get what that means. In this mix comes, and this is really the last pivotal event that I will mention before turning to the revolution in my last 10 minutes of 59 in the contemporary age. But in this moment, in the First Republic, there is a political movement that is in fact cross-racial, but was led primarily by Black leaders, veterans of the independence struggle, who were highly prestigious. Evaristo Estenos in particular, who had achieved the rank of general by 1906 and by 1908, was a legendary figure in the labor movement. He was an intellectual. He was a liberal. He was a member of the Liberal Party. And without him, the liberals would never have garnered to themselves the kind of votes that they did. They were the majority party in the early 20th century. Evaristo Estenos created what he labeled the Independent Party of Color, or Partido Independiente de Color, in 1908. Almost immediately by 1909, the Cuban Congress banned it by declaring that any Cubans who organized themselves on the basis of race were racist and were defying Jose Martí and supposedly Antonio Maceo's vision of the anti-racist nation, which was more than black and white. So this party was forced to operate illegally and underground. Its newspaper was confiscated by 1911 and raided. Many of these leaders were imprisoned. And so when they were released, by 1912, they decided to take action. It was the 10th anniversary of the independence of Cuba from the United States, May 20th, 1912. They staged what was supposed to be a brief armed protest, and they were met with a visceral reaction that was unprecedented in the history of Cuba, perhaps only similar to the reaction of the Spanish and the planting elite in 1844 that carried out a massive campaign of intimidation and terror against slaves and enslaved people and free people of color. From May of 1912 to September of 1912, the Cuban government carried out a massacre of Blacks, not only those who were members of the party, but basically anyone across the country. The Black Massacre of 1912 enforced the idea that Black activism in Cuba was treasonous, that it was an affront to the nation, and that anybody who complained about, criticized or complained about racism under this wonderful, and it was called at the time, revolutionary regime and republic, was a traitor. So in that period, between 4,000 and 8,000 Blacks were murdered. Mostly by the Cuban army, but also by white vigilantes who were granted and deputized by the Cuban government to carry out these attacks. The United States facilitated the purchase of submachine guns by the army, which was able to test that out on civilians. This group does not just include Black men, but young women and children and families. Another 15,000 Blacks were imprisoned and held without charge or bond for years in Cuban jails. And incredibly, according to the Cuban military, which published an account of its heroic acts, a total of only 17 white soldiers were killed in what was called La Guerra Racista, the racist war of 1912, implying that the Blacks were the racists. 8 of these whites were killed by their own comrades on suspicion of sympathizing with the Black racists. So what were the results of 1912 for racial equality in Cuba? Well, you can imagine. For decades, really, it was impossible to organize politically and autonomously from the two main political parties, which were largely the Liberal and the Conservative Party. And there was very little socioeconomic or political mobility for Blacks. Blacks became clients in a very paternalistic patron-client relationship between the state or the political parties and then the voters. And in fact, the Black vote remained the swing vote throughout the Republic. And so there would be this kind of payback for effectively voting in your white representative. So there was tremendous opportunity for change and really very little of it for Blacks. By 1959, however, when the Cuban Revolution took power, the idea that the revolution would eliminate racism and institutionalize racism in particular was central to its success, particularly in 59 to 61. However, what I want to argue in my last few minutes is that the Cuban Revolution's adoption of state communism in 1961 and creation of a one-party state silenced debate, silenced even knowledge of what racism and racial prejudice or inequality was, and it continues to do that. The official position of the Cuban government by 1962 remains the position of the Cuban government in 2020, and that is that racism is a vestige of the past, that it is a personal attitude, and that it has no place and does not exist in Cuban institutions of any kind, whether they are schools, they are cultural institutions, the media, the government, none of that. So this is rather impossible to stomach if you take a look at the media in Cuba today or the University of Havana and you find virtually no Black faces. Statistics are also not published on race when the Cuban government publishes them, in an effort, in fact, perhaps to silence that comparison between where was the Black in the 50s and where is the Black now, as we would say in Spanish in Cuba, and activists often say. So how did the Cuban Revolution silence debate and knowledge of what racism was? Well, surely through the adoption of paternalism and the idea that, especially in the 60s and the 70s, that all Blacks should be loyal to the Cuban Revolution. They should be grateful for the dramatic shifts in power that were achieved by the lower classes, regardless of color, through the simple adoption of socialism and the access that that's provided to schools, etc. Nonetheless, as emblematic in this image here, you know, the Black child is really the icon of the Black citizen in Cuba from the 60s through the 70s. And by the 80s, you really don't even have a Black icon of any nature. The race question became irrelevant because the state convinced itself, if not the people, that it had triumphed over racism. So in three ways, you get a silencing of debate and knowledge. First, the nationalization of the economy and the nationalization of all forms of civil society between 1961 and 1968 ensured the displacement or the elimination of all independent discussion outside of government-controlled spaces. And, you know, rather tragically, that included the elimination of almost 2,000 Black mutual aid societies and social clubs where Blacks had focused and people of color had focused their energies in creating an alternative space for empowerment, for discussion, and for mutual aid, as in fact the societies were called. The second way in which the Cuban state's adoption of communism and its one-party rule ensured the silencing of debate and discussion of racism happened very dramatically in February 1962, when Fidel Castro announced the revolution's triumph over all forms of racism. So his argument was that because all private schools had been nationalized and all of the economy was now in the hands of the state, that really there was no place anymore for this. But he very much articulated it as a total triumph. Racism had ceased to exist in Cuba. And so it became then the official position of the government that racism was a vestige of the past and not something imbricated in the forms of interaction, in the curriculum of schools, in the highlighting and sponsorship by the government of Eurocentric culture as literally cultura universal, universal culture. Or government condemnation of many forms of Black culture as inherently criminal. And so in particular, Santeria in 1971 and then again in 1974 was declared to be a source of oscurantismo, right? But also a criminal culture. And so it was the most persecuted of all religions at the time when the state was an atheist state. That would end in 1991 when the Cuban state adopted the reform of becoming a secular state and allowing for expressions of freedom of religion. Nonetheless, this period of the 60s, particularly 65 through the 80s, is a period in which not only was Santeria persecuted, but all real expressions of autonomous expressions of Black Cuban racial consciousness, critical historical memory, and cultural autonomy were seen as threats to national security. They were labeled ideologically diversionary, and people who were accused of this were targeted. They were often subject to forced labor as a method of rehabilitation, and made to renounce as false consciousness what were efforts to criticize and to unpack the ways in which racism was reproduced in the daily life of Cubans or in the institutional and cultural life of the country. So I want to end with some images of how much has really changed, at least for the citizenry. In 1991, when the Cuban state reformed the economy in order to survive the absence of Soviet subsidies, it effectively legalized entrepreneurial activities through licensing of individual citizens and self-employment. And this opened the door for artists and for intellectuals and musicians to begin to craft a kind of alternative understanding of Cuban society and reality. But it also opened the door for all kinds of interaction with foreigners and with external forms of knowledge. And now, literally since about 2011, when Raul Castro increasingly, and then 2016, opened the door to the internet for Cubans. This possibility has allowed for Cubans to really engage in a very critical and dramatic way with what is an overwhelming degree of evidence of not just Eurocentrism, but government-sponsored racism. So Douglas Perez says this best perhaps in this image called Identity, where you see the kind of spaces, the sort of ideal Cuban Black image, or so he would perhaps argue with this painting. And it's a very direct reference to Bola de Nieve, who was a Black musician who survived the revolution, died, I believe, in the late 60s, and had become internationally renowned because he played to all white audiences at a bar across from the National Hotel. So Cubans also in the 90s found themselves playing the role, Black Cubans, but all Cubans began to play the role of the exotic, hypersexualized, overly servile person in order to gain the attention of tourists and to gain foreign currency, which was essential to their own survival in the absence of government aid and subsidies to their even just their diet. Hip hop artists, particularly Escuadrón Patriota, as well as others, began to record and sell their music on their own. And I've given you a link, and I think that we're going to supply that to you later, to this particular song and video called No Más Discriminación, which is a really brutal portrayal of how, in very direct ways, Cubans feel themselves attacked for their Black consciousness and for their desire to see equality at the forefront of the nation's goals. It's also an assault on, visual and otherwise, on the ways in which the government ensures police harassment of Blacks and their marginalization from public space and self-representation. Black Cubans are subject to police harassment far more than white Cubans are, and all you have to do is go to Havana and walk across the city, and I bet you on any given day, you're gonna see at least 5 to 10 young Black men stopped for no reason by the cops and searched. Some of them will be arrested, others will be ticketed. it is part and parcel of the everyday experience of an urban, non-white Cuban, but particularly males, to experience this. And yet at the same time, even as they are subject to this constant surveillance and suspicion of their motives, even of their solidarity with one another as somehow subversive. It is clearly part of the ethos of Black communities in Cuba, and there are many of them in cities, and this is very much Centro Habana. It's very much a part parcel of their experience and the source of pride that they gain, these communities gain, to critique what is happening, to denounce it, and that they are able to do so today is not an automatic or a given. They are able to do so today, and perhaps more than ever before, are able to do so because the United States has supplied them recently, at least until 2016, with evidence that contradicts the idea that Blacks are incompetent or that Blacks cannot lead a country. So I will end with this in the hope that we can discuss together as a group the various ways in which anti-Blackness should be the central concern, as Chris said at the beginning, and the many ways in which our societies really are defined by that concept. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Lily. What I would like, I learned a lot today from the 3 talks, and I think that would be nice to have a first round where you guys from the panel start to exchange ideas, comments to each other, and then we will open up for questions from the audience. So why don't you start, Chris, with your reactions or comments or questions to the other panelists, and then we do the same with Lily and with Carmen. Thank you.
Yeah, so as I was over here taking notes, I would say for myself, perhaps one of the more consistent themes across each talk, I'm gonna go back to my quotation of Hartman here, where Hartman reminds us again that both Blackness and Black people are called upon to affirm the state, but only until our present sullies paradise. I just found that again to be the most consistent theme, or at least a theme that I've noted in listening to the 2 talks and thinking about some of the parallels and layers. I think when we look at indigeneity, right, in the concept, in the context of Ecuador, and when we look at Blackness within the context of Cuba, there is this desire to affirm the state, right, by superficially and in a very cursory manner, mapping Blackness, be it through Black historical narratives, or through current political paradigms unto the nation state, to give the nation state a certain texture, a certain substance, right? I think when we look at the work of many other scholars of Latin America who also talk about the folklorization, for example, of Blackness and of indigeneity and this contributions to forming the state. But again, once we start to map this onto the political, that's where the resistance is met, all right? And so there's that secondary, almost childlike status, as both of you brought up, in which Blacks and Indigenous, Black folk and Indigenous folk are placed in within the nation state frame, within the consciousness of the nation state. So I would say for myself, again, that was perhaps one of the most, I think, visible connections across our panels.
Is mine on? I have to say I was very struck by a lot of points, particularly the notion that Chris stated at the beginning, that curriculum structures consciousness, and the many ways in which the afterlife of slavery, as you put it, is a material one, and it remains unaddressed, because then we actually, if we address that, imagine in all of the slave societies of this hemisphere, including Cuba, then, you know, what does it require? You know, and requiring symbolic change, like pulling down statues that have been iconic of and also representations of violence on people for decades. That's one thing, but that sort of seems to, you know, go too far for some people and way too far for others. But it sort of it can become a substitute for, in fact, addressing what are the real life legacies of the lack of access, the banning, the criminalization, the marginality. I mean, Cuba has a bazillion problems. And in fact, one of the things that I find really fabulous about the last 30 years is that race and racism, when they are the center of discussion, then in fact, you really, really get to the heart of inequality and what creates it, and how do you have true egalitarianism if that's your goal? You know, what are the structures that impede that? You know, so that's why I think it was always so threatening in ways that really go beyond racial consciousness, and the discussion itself, I mean, was really so threatening from at least 1961 through the present. It remains so threatening to the nature of the system of power in Cuba, but the ways in which it's threatening are not dissimilar to the ways in which things like the effort to seek amelioration, material amelioration for the legacies of slavery in the United States are to the system of power that we have here.
Okay, so what I can say, two things. Yeah, I saw a lot of common themes in the three talks, which was very interesting. On the one hand, what Chris was just saying about the state needing to affirm itself by superficially mapping Blackness and indigeneity, and the folklorization. It even went beyond. In the case of Ecuador that I was using, I couldn't go to the details because I was using too much time. But for instance, there was an event by this government, which is also, that's another parallel with what Lily was explaining, also a government that is supposed to be a leftist government or progressive, the government of Rafael Correa of the 21st century, socialism and all that, in which the white urban, or I don't know if they would call themselves white or mestizo, urban government officials had, there was a discussion of the development plans that were supposed to take into account the idea of summa causa, and they had mestizo people dressed as indigenous with the different objectives of the government in a sign there. And then they had a ballet that is a ballet of mestizos who dress as indigenous. It's called Hachiwa, which is kind of a celebration of the patrons, kind of gifts to indigenous people in the hacienda. And they had these people dancing, mestizos dressed as indigenous. And that was in an event that was supposed to celebrate the state taking indigenous ideas like summa causa into account. So this folklorization, that this kind of spectacle and spectre, I think that's a very important idea that Chris was using. And also in Lily's talk, I was thinking like in a past life for my master's, I did work on Puerto Rico on the idea of race in 19th century Puerto Rico. And that's where I actually started to be interested in paternalism. At that time. So there are many parallels with the treatment of indigenous also and Black people in Latin America. And the first thing that surprised me about the debate on slavery in Puerto Rico was that there were also like pro-slavery, and then the advocates who were also white, like some of the leaders like Martí of Puerto Rico, who talk about the slaves, like they wanted to abolish slavery, but not because the slaves were people, but because it said something bad about the nation, that it would degrade the democracy, but it kind of, the voice of the slaves was absent. So that was my first interest in this topic. And when Lily was talking, I thought that there were a lot of also parallels there on paternalism. My question would be whether there are some specificities, because the colonial state did have the protectores de indios, but not, I wonder whether there was such a figure for people of African descent or Blacks in Latin America, of somebody talking for them legally and officially, because these protectores de indios would talk for indigenous, and they were kind of hired by the crown to do so, because indigenous people were children and irrational and spoke unintelligible languages, so they couldn't speak. But the whole idea of voice, of lack of voice, I think it was very important in all the talks. I wonder whether in history there is something similar in the Caribbean.
Well, I mean, that kind of has an easy answer, and it actually leads directly back to the question of policing and how police forces represent the interests and values of the state. I mean, the Spanish in Cuba in particular granted, as they did elsewhere in Latin America, but particularly in Cuba, they granted free Blacks, right, the opportunity, for instance, to form a royalist militia. So, then you have, and you also had bands of militias in the city of Havana whose sole purpose was to go out and repress rebellion, right? And so they were supposed to surveil enslaved and free people of color, but they were themselves Black. And so this is a brilliant move, because then you basically have representatives of the planter elite and the Spanish royalty, the Spanish royal interests, in the bodies in Black bodies. I mean, you're using Black people to repress other Black people. And so this is actually relevant to contemporary age, because one of the things that Cubans observed in the early 90s, when the state opened itself up to tourism, was first that the Cuban Ministry of Tourism began to fire everybody who was Black and worked in a public capacity. And literally Alejandro Lafuente has a chapter in a book that was published in 2001, where he cites the documents that said that they could not work, should not work in this kind of public capacity, like for instance, at a hotel, and the first person that would encounter tourists, because they don't look right. They don't have the right look. So that's one thing that was clearly observed and it's been documented. But the other is that the police forces in Havana and elsewhere expanded. And they expanded largely because the state began to hire people from Oriente province. And these are people who are highly disdained in Havana. They have a heavy accent. There's a kind of racialization of them because they're darker in general. So you had Orientales, who are called and disdained as Palestinians, literally in Havana, that's what people call them, working in a new section of the police. So these people who are stopping the young Black males, 9 times out of 10, they are Orientales, and they are themselves Black. This works at the level of the citizenry in very divisive ways, because what white racists will say in Cuba is that, look, well, they complain about how they're being harassed by the police, but the ones who are doing it are the Blacks. The Blacks are harassing the Blacks. And then it allows them to deflect the kind of outrage that they should feel towards the state onto the police, and to racialize that outrage. These things favor a virtually all white state, and it is very, very much a kind of an echo of the royal regime of the 19th century approach to policing and surveilling free people of color and enslaved people by finding, right? I mean, I don't have to say further, it's very much an echo, and it's brilliant. It works very, very well. Works very well in their favor. And then there's, of course, no place to discuss this, right? Except in hip hop, You know, this is where you find the discussions in hip hop, in art, in online fora that 99% or maybe 95% of the population never sees. So it becomes also a means by which, I mean, that even access to that social media and the internet has recently become a means for the state to manage dissent and dissidence simply by creating a space for it, but it's self-contained, you know, and it doesn't reach out to the general populace. It's not the subject. You can't talk about these things in a classroom, in other words.
Well, thank you. Let me start with some questions from the audience, and we have a few. When there is one that says, from Maria, says, based on the history of racism in the Americans and the significant influence of the US in Latin America's social-political fabric, do you see parallels between Cuban revolutionary rule and the political context in the United States in which protest and any other form of engagement in anti-racist activities have been criminalized as a movement towards the formation of an authoritarian one-party rule in the United States? And let me ask a couple of questions more. Here's a question to Chris. Says, do you have an example of how even after the constitutional recognition of people of African descent and indigenous, there is still a negation of their citizenship? And to Carmen, in what way does racism become more visible when an indigenous person obtains a higher level position, like becoming a minister? So let us start with those questions that are, I mean, even though they were asked to a particular person, any of you can address. So can we start with Chris?
Yeah, sorry, just writing down the question here. So to answer that question, well, let's see. First, I laid out several examples in the talk, but here's where I would refer this individual to in terms of answering this question, right? And so I think we can look at this several ways. First and foremost, I think we can look at this through the lens of the afterlife of slavery. So if you were to look at any country in Latin America, right, especially those who adopted your more robust constitutional and multicultural reforms in the 1980s and 1990s, and if you were to look statistically at life expectancy, if you were to look statistically at access to higher education, if you were to look statistically at access to healthcare, amongst many other factors, social factors, right? Because these are social facts. They will point you to the fact that Black lives in Latin America, both pre and post constitutional reform, continue to exist in this state of afterlife, right? So the statistics show it. There are also forms of evidence in terms of racial violence, right? So I think one of the things that Dr. Tanya Saunders did really well in the first talk was laying out the numbers of Black people who are killed annually, right, in Brazil. I think we can turn our attention towards Colombia and the assassination of Black and indigenous social leaders. Over 120 already this year, right, in quarantine, okay, of Black and indigenous social leaders in Colombia. And so the idea of evidence of the negation of Black life and of indigenous life in Latin America post-constitutional reform is hyper evident, is hyper visible. Now, I think it might be in many ways difficult to register because discourses of racial democracy are just that, ensconced in the nation, right? So it's harder to break through those discourses. But if you're to merely turn attention to what's around you, again, in terms of those metrics, in terms of the afterlife of slavery, which you even have to recognize that some of those metrics are difficult to measure, because there's, in some countries in Latin America, you can't even identify as Black on the census, right? So in some places, we even have that barrier as well. I'll leave off my answer there, so that way Dr. Guerra and Carmen can respond.
Should I? Oh no. Okay, so this is a very good question. Racism more visible when indigenous person gets a higher position, like being a politician or a minister? I think that the answer could be different in Mexico and Ecuador. When I was in Mexico in the 1990s, the way indigeneity was defined by the government was that somebody who learned Spanish and moved to a city was not indigenous anymore. That person became mestizo. So by definition, and the way the government talk, even under the solidarity program of Salinas de Gortari and so on, they talk about indigenous as the poorest among the poor. So sometimes the government was interested in the indigenous, not because they were indigenous, but because they were the poorest among the poor. And they claim that if they achieve an education, a formal education, then they would stop being indigenous. So it was kind of a contradiction in terms, and that might have changed in more recent, like in the 2000s in Mexico. In the case of Ecuador, yes, there are like the two things. On the one hand, it's good that an indigenous person, like in the case of Evo Morales becoming the president of Bolivia, or indigenous ministers in Ecuador, that there have been several of them in the last decade. It is important because it changes like the public sphere, and people start to think. It was very important, for instance, for indigenous people that Evo Morales became a president as a role model. So that's one side of it. There is backlash racism also against Evo or against ministers in Ecuador. Very often ministers of color who are indigenous or Black, in the case of Ecuador, are given ministries that have less importance, sometimes culture or something that doesn't matter that much, or sometimes the minister of peoples. And very often they would have like a vice minister who is white or mestizo, that would kind of have influence on the decisions that are made. So this could be again a case of what Chris was saying before, of using the face but not the voice, just like a kind of superficially diversifying the government, but it still is important because people will try to talk and they do have a voice. So I think it's kind of contradictory. There were many cases in which, like jokes, racist jokes about female indigenous politicians being like domestic servants and things like that, like happened to also to the Nobel Prize, Rigoberta Menchú, that there was the kind of, that the idea that they were going to make a doll that would be like the employee or servant of Barbie, and that would be like the Rigoberta Menchú doll. So there are these kinds of jokes, like indigenous people who are ministers, instead of using the mouse, they use a guinea pig, a queen. So there are many, many racist jokes and racist backlash, but on the other hand, the indigenous people, in the case of Ecuador, I have witnessed how they have kind of opened spaces there and fought for their dignity. And even when I was a professor in Flaxo for 8 years in Quito, you found the indigenous people asserting their space. Like if, let's say, the director of the university would not say good morning to them in the elevator, and he would ignore their presence there, they would say, Mr. President, in my community, we say good morning when we meet people. And then the president would have to say, oh, I'm so sorry, I was thinking. So they would kind of fight for their space. And I think it's important that they are there, but still there will be this backlash racism that happens when a person kind of advances socially.
You know, I have to say that I'm struck by how incredibly colonial your examples are, because of course, colonial the Viceroyalty of Peru, if you moved from the countryside where you were part of the República de Indios and you left the village, you were no longer Indian by law. You know, you were now, you know, either a forastero or you were a casta. And if you adopted the clothing, independently of whether you adopted the clothing, I mean, it's stunning how colonial this is. But I wanted to say that I think that protest is intrinsic to democratization, and we must have it in this country to re-democratize on a regular basis. And we need to have massive protests like we've been having, ones that cannot be ignored. And so when you criminalize protest, or you simply label the protesters terrorists or traitors, you are ensuring, especially if you are a government figure like Trump, or you do so in law as Cuban law does, you are ensuring de-democratization, you know, the opposite of democracy in all forms, as the values being promoted and encouraged by the state, if not enforced. I will also say that, you know, there's a lot of scariness to the Cuban legal regime. I mean, there is a law that says you cannot disobey a police officer. And so people get, you know, charged and they get written up for desobediencia, you know, disobedience. These kinds of ideas, you know, really speak to how the authority of the state can be completely embodied in an agent of the state like a cop, with no accountability whatsoever. And it is interesting that what has made police accountable in the United States is the use of cell phone videos. I mean, the same is true in Cuba. When Raul Castro legalized the right to own a cell phone in 2011, you know, I don't think he was ready at all, nor was anybody else, for people to start filming the repression of protesters on the street. And that summer in particular, the summer of 2009 through the summer of 2010, was a year in which on any particular day, you go on YouTube and people will have posted these little cell phone videos of somebody picking up a sign and standing, for instance, on the steps of the Capitol building, three people, and then the police immediately there, and they are uniformed cops trying to get these women, in many cases there would be women, to put their signs down. And then the crowd would all pull their cell phones and start filming. And this is a really extraordinary instrument. And it speaks to the power of being able to witness, you know, even when you're far away, these scenes of injustice. We have to witness the scenes of injustice, and then we have to participate in the protest against that injustice on a massive scale, or nothing can change. And we don't achieve democracy again. And I do think democracy is a process of constant re-democratization through protest. It is intrinsic to any kind of political, economic, or social change, and the change that has to happen up here too.
Okay, I have a couple of more questions. There is one question just for Chris, and it's by Professor Emily Hind. And her question is, does the College of Education at UF already teach a better curriculum? Is that UF curriculum in line with the K-12 material that future teachers will use? And then there is another question for all of you. From somebody in the audience that said, what is interesting about these examples of the left and racism, because we have always been expecting, because of what they have preached and because they want to create better forms of democracy, that the left will have a better solutions or a better record when dealing with race. But in the case of the Cuban Revolution, that's not necessarily the case. And in the case of some of the left-wing regimes, like the one in Ecuador or perhaps Bolivia and Venezuela, that's not also the case. So.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yep, making more notes. So the question about curriculum, and I'm going to address it broadly while implicating the institutions named in the question. All right, so one of the things that we have to understand with the creation of curriculum is who writes the curriculum, right? So not many of us ask this question, right? Who writes the standards that our children are required to learn, right? And then the ways in which standardized testing functions as a form of surveillance on those standards, ensuring that teachers do teach to those standards. We have to understand the role of capitalism, and in particular racial capitalism in this. The textbook industry is a $1 billion industry in the United States that is directly connected to the formation of the standards, right? And when you look at states, for example, such as Texas, who play a major role in the textbook industry, what is often written by textbook authors and publishers out of Texas are used across the country.
Yeah.
They're just reformatted, changed. They'll map the standards from another state onto the text, those standards that you see in the margins, all right? But I use Texas, for example, because you have to look at the role of the State Board of Education in the creation of standards. And at one point, the leader of the State Board of Education was a dentist who believed in creationism, right? Along a myriad of other problematic beliefs that made their way into the standards, all right? Now, here's where surveillance also factors into this conversation. When colleges of education are training or preparing teachers, pre-service teachers to become future educators, those pre-service teachers have to pass an exam. Well, guess what that exam is based on? The K-12 standards that they are going to be required to teach. And that plays a major role in determining the courses that are offered for our pre-service teachers. All right, and so we know that the standards, for example, are Eurocentric in nature, just to give an example, and written towards a whitewashed version of history. So this means our pre-service teachers are not encouraged to take courses in African American history, in Black diasporic history, in Latinx or Latin American history or Afro-Latin American history, because this praxis exam that they have to pass at the end of their degree program is centered on white Eurocentric history. All right, and so this is how they all tend to function together. And then we go out into the schools and replicate this. And so this isn't happenstance. It just doesn't fall out of the sky. This is coordinated, this is systematic, and this is intentional. All right, so we have to ask questions about disrupting and divesting from this systematic way of incorporating these problematic anti-Black narratives into the classroom. I'll start off the question about the left, and then I'll leave it to you all to chime in. Speaking from a US context, one of the things that we have to understand is that racism is endemic, not just to society in the US, but across the Americas and across the globe. Whether a particular leader is politically aligned with the left or the right does not negate that fact. Now, I think at times we may have these post-racial narratives that may emerge more colloquially, right? Or become more part of the common everyday lexicon, for example, as we saw with Barack Obama. But Black Lives Matter, for example, all right, this movement that is still going on began under Barack Obama's administration, right? A Black president's administration. And so I think we have to disrupt the idea of this dichotomous left-right political paradigm and one being viewed as allegedly more progressive as being more aptly able to alleviate racism or racial concerns in whatever respective nation state. So I'll leave it there, and I'll listen to Dr. Guerra and Dr. Novo chime in on this one.
Go ahead, Carmen. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I was talking. Yeah, the question of the left and racism. Well, this is very difficult to talk about, and maybe Lily has a similar experience, but because it's almost taboo. Because because of the polarization, if you criticize anything on the left, you would be placed on the right, and then at least that happened with the socialism of the 21st century very clearly. But I think it's not homogeneous or monolithic, but it's very important if the left thinks of a kind of moving forward from all these kind of injustices and inequalities and hierarchies to exercise self-criticism. They cannot, I mean, I define myself as from the left, and my family comes like all the way from my great-grandfather was an anarchist in Spain in the early 20th century. But so I would associate with it, but at the same time think that we cannot depart from a place of self-righteousness, but we have to depart from an openness to self-criticism. And it's very difficult to talk about these things because you are very easily kind of dismiss what you say because of placing you on the right. So I would stop there for now.
Well, I'll just add that, you know, in Cuba, I started going to Cuba in 1995, and I lived there for a year when I did my dissertation work from 96 to 97. And then I've been going continuously until 2019. And what I found really disrupted in a big way the monopoly that Marxism held over history, over reality in Cuba was race. Because in Cuba, it was so, the degree to which it had been discussed at all was so caricatured, or it was so narrowly defined as to, for instance, be only important when it came to talking about the United States, you know? And even there, most Cubans didn't know what happened after 1968, you know, no idea. And so when I started taking American students to Cuba, and many of them would be African American because in part they were drawn to the curriculum. It was about slavery and the legacies of slavery in Cuba. So at least, you know, a group of 12, we'd had 5, you know, a group of 22, we had 7. These kids were assaulted by this extraordinary degree of ignorance on the part of, you know, Black Cubans, mulatto Cubans, and white Cubans. And literally it took the same form. They would find themselves alone somewhere in a hotel or on the street as soon as they arrived, or sometimes at the airport, and somebody would find out that they were college students from the United States, and they would say, wow, Black people go to college in the United States? I mean, that's how ignorant the Cuban state had made its population. And these trips were 2001, 2003, and 2005. I mean, it was an amazing experience for these young people to witness just how much this was controlled. And then secondly, slavery until the 90s was really seen technically in Cuban curriculum as a system of labor. You know, it was like, there were kids who didn't even know, like young kids that I encountered because I had hundreds of relatives in Cuba, and the vast majority of the ones who are now in their 30s or in their 20s, you know, they were teenagers or they were very young. Many children did not know that slaves came from Africa. Like they didn't understand what that meant. You know, they just thought, you know, they had never really grasped it. And the only way that they knew anything beyond what they were told in the classroom, which was this very, very rigid, narrow class definition of the movement of history and slavery as a system of labor, the only thing that disrupted that was their friendships with Black children. You know, like in St. Havana, which is where a big part of my family lives, that is a 70 to 80%, you know, Afro-Cuban area. And so these kids were getting the Black children, the mulatto children are getting a completely different version of history than those who are whiter and were just listening to their teachers, you know. And so it was their relationships with one another that allowed for them to question, you know. but I think that this, I mean, I'm not clear as to what exactly it means, but I do think that there are various forms of Marxism and state monopolies, you know, on memory and history and media, when combined with Marxism, meaning that state ownership of 80% of the economy. And currently right now, Cuba's government still owns 80% of the economy, despite the fact that it has embraced this kind of version of the non-state sector since 1991 and legalized it. It still controls 80% of the economy, and the vast majority of Cubans still work for the state. So when you have a situation when your livelihood depends on your loyalty to the regime, and for decades, your performance of loyalty to the regime, then you are less likely to question the versions of reality that you get from the classroom, from the regime, from, you know, it doesn't also help the Cubans an island. But, you know, in Cuba, I think the most disruptive thing that perhaps I ever did as a teacher was to bring African-American students with me and have them be there for 6 weeks. I mean, who cares? By the end of this experience, the Cubans they encountered learned more from them than those students ever learned about Cuba. You know, they learned a whole different understanding of their reality and what they had been taught about Cubans, not just about the United States, simply by having African-American young people there, teaching them, talking, self-representing. You know, it was really a revelation. It was a revelation. But I do think that there is something inherently problematic to a left that also continues to celebrate and anchor itself in Marx when the man spent like 7 pages talking about the slave trade in the 1840s. You know, I mean, that's all he spent, 7 pages, and it was critical to the development of capitalism. Without slavery, you don't get global imperialism, you don't get global capitalism, and without the slave trade producing things like sugar, you don't get the industrialization. Sugar, cotton, those mills are all related to each other. And so it is Black bodies that are producing the wealth of capitalism. You know, I mean, that I think is really important. And so if we look at Marx for our inspiration, we are automatically endorsing not just Eurocentrism, but a pro-slavery view of the world. It's a racial blind that he has.
Well, unfortunately, we have to stop because it's 12 o'clock and past 12. It has been, thank you very much, Chris, Lily, Carmen. This has been a very interesting, a fantastic conversation. And I really appreciate the time that you have put to make this happen. And I want to thank everybody that joined in for listening to us. And we will continue to have this type of events throughout the summer and next semester. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was
It's like a mini Lhasa here, but better.
Okay, we're stopping the live stream 1 second.